Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 22nd of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates and details, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction, about the village by the name of Lyptsy. Probably 10 days ago, correct me if I'm wrong, the Russians reached the outskirts and the first buildings of the village from the north. The Russians entered the, let's say, residential part from the village by the name of Gliboko, and as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to bypass the forests and to answer, let's say, Lyptsy from Lukyansk direction. But after that, we stopped receiving any updates about the situation in Lyptsy, and this is the most weird thing ever since the beginning of the special military operation. 10 days, there are very heavy clashes for very important town, for strategical town, and we have no information neither from the Russian side nor from the Ukrainian. Of course, based on that, we can make conclusions that currently the situation most likely in Lyptsy is very difficult. And there are two ways of how to think. First of all, maybe the Russians are not storming Lyptsy at all. Maybe the Russians reached the outskirts of the village and they stopped because they managed to complete the main task they wanted, and the purpose of attack on Lyptsy was to force the Ukrainians to fall back, not even the Ukrainians, but to force the Ukrainians to redeploy artillery as far as possible from Lyptsy and as close as possible to Kharkiv. And maybe this is enough, that was enough for the Russians, and they reduced the number of strikes, artillery strikes on the village, on the Belgorod. So maybe this is the reason why the Russians are moving further. From the other side, probably, and maybe there are very heavy clashes inside of the village. Both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, suffering significant losses, and both sides, neither the Russians nor Ukrainians, are able to get complete initiative and direction and can't break the situation in the favor. When talking about the Russians, we understand they basically don't have enough of manpower. They introduced significant number of forces, but they were limited at the beginning. But when talking about the Ukrainians, they're continuing sending more and more forces in this direction. We have 42nd mechanized. We will start receiving updates about the 92nd mechanized. We have, let's say, 13th, so lots of brigades, and the Ukrainians continue this process. For example, we got very interesting updates from Volchansk. According to information we have, the first Marine brigades from Kherson direction have arrived on this direction, in the vicinity of Volchansk, and started redeployment and getting their positions. From Kherson direction, Marine brigades start coming to Volchansk. Furthermore, we got a very interesting video from the northern Volchansk itself. For example, on this video we can see the work of 82nd Air Assault Brigade. This brigade used to be located in the vicinity of Robotina, and now we start receiving the first videos of how they were operating in the northern Volchansk, trying to counterattack the Russians. And if you take a look at the map, at the colors, you're gonna see that this attack took place, according to at least my map, on the territory that is under control of Russian forces. So the Ukrainian striker that was striking was operating, let's say, in the vicinity of these warehouses, this is industrial zone, and was attacking the Russian offensive forces. So most likely the Ukrainians managed to concentrate significant forces and they started their own counterattacks. Very difficult to understand, but anyway, one thing I know for sure, that it's too early to color the entire northern Volchansk as the territory under Russian control. There are still Ukrainian positions. Most likely the Ukrainians still control significant number of streets, buildings, and so on, and there are still very heavy clashes. Now let's move to this part of Volchansk. We have lots of very interesting updates. Today the Russian sources published the video of how they were bombing the citadel. Let's call this block of Volchansk the citadel, because there is high-rise building area with significant number of buildings, and the Russians were bombing this territory, probably with stealth flamethrower systems, aviation, and another strikes were published from this area. The Russians were bombing the main temporary position of Ukrainian forces that the Ukrainians are using to control the situation along the Volcha River, trying to prevent, let's say, another Russian attempts to cross Volcha River itself. So what is important about the strikes? Once again, the situation is very difficult, but this video confirms that most likely the Russians haven't taken under control this high-rise area of Volchansk. But we got another interesting video from a little bit southern part in the vicinity of Volchansky aggregatny plant. On this video, for example, there is a batch of videos of Ukrainian attacks on the Russian forces, and one of the episodes took place in this area. This is the Volchansk police department, and according to the author of a video that was published by the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian artillery forces were bombing the Russian forces in the area of Volchansk police department, so which confirms Russian control over the territory. And now this video explains a lot. At least it explains me that the Russians decided not to attack the citadel itself, and the Russians are trying to bypass citadel from the east, then from the west, from the southwest, and then from the south, and to attack the main supply road that Ukrainians are using to control and to support their forces in the citadel. I'm talking about this road from industrial zone further to the north. As soon as the Russians are able to cut this territory, the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back, obviously to the south, and maybe in direction of industrial zone, and maybe after that to leave Volchansk completely. But the Ukrainians are trying to prevent this. They're sending, as you can see, more and more forces. They still have possibilities to redeploy forces to the north, and mainly the Ukrainians are using, of course, bridges and pontoon bridges. Now let's move to the eastern Volchansk, because we have a lot of very interesting details about this territory. If you remember, a few days ago we were talking that the Russians managed to improve their positions. They started another offensive operation. They have introduced additional reinforcements and reserves, and according to those posts, the Russians were heading exactly on this direction. So the villages Tikha, Zybina, the villages Volokhovka, Bachkova, and so on. And on this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were bombing Volchansk itself, bombing lots of towns and settlements on this direction. And the most important, the Russians destroyed another bridge. This is the bridge that was destroyed, and this is a very important question. Because this is the fourth bridge that was destroyed on this direction since the beginning of the, let's say, Volchansk offensive operation. If we increase the numbers of this, we're going to see a lot of explosions. The first bridge was destroyed during the first day of attack by the Russian forces on the 10th of May. This is Zybina, and the bridge was destroyed as a result of probably maybe artillery strike or maybe something else. Later, we got updates of how the Russians destroyed the next bridge in the vicinity of Volchansk Hutory. This video was published on the next day, on the 11th of May, so 2 days in a row the Russians were concentrating, at least some party was concentrating on destroying of the bridges. Later, on the 21st of May, we got the video of how, according to this source, the Russians destroyed another bridge further to the east from Volchansk itself, and this is the explosion, and as a result of the strike, the bridge was destroyed, most likely. And today we got another video of the fourth bridge destroyed in the area. So this is very important, because also I have a lot of questions why the Russians destroying the bridges. Of course, you might say that the Ukrainians, by concentrating significant forces, now have possibilities to organize counterattacks. So they're using the bridges, they can cross Vovchi River and to attack the Russian forces in the flank. So it's of course it's possible. It's possible. It's really possible. You don't need to think that this is like something stupid or something like this. It's possible, right? So this is the reason why the Russians are destroying the bridges, trying to reduce any risks from the eastern flank of Volchansk offensive operation. But from the other side, the bridges might be destroyed by the Ukrainians, because they understand that the Russians currently are storming the northern part, and after the end of the northern part, they need to enter the southern part. And the best solution, the easiest way for the Russians to do this, is to cross Vovchi River and to attack Volchansk Hutory, and then to move to the eastern part exactly from this direction. From this perspective, it is smart for Ukrainians to destroy the bridges. So for now, the sources was published, the Russian sources, so most likely the bridges were destroyed by the Russians. But if the Russians are destroying the bridges, that means that the Russians understand that there are very high risks that Ukrainians can counterattack, and they will counterattack from the eastern flank of Volchansk offensive operation. So very interesting, and everything very complicated. Furthermore, I just remind you that more and more sources, more and more people are saying that experts, military experts, and different even NATO officers and other, let's say, sources are saying that Volchansk and Kharkiv direction are not the primary target for the Russians. This is the secondary target. The main purpose of the target is to stretch the Ukrainian resources, reserves, their armies, and then as soon as the Ukrainians do this, the Russians will attack somewhere. For now, nobody knows for sure where exactly the Russians are planning to make their primary attack. Everything is very complicated. Everything is very complicated, but let's see what is going to be next. Now we're moving further to Kupyansk area. We haven't received almost anything from the direction, just some activity in Staromaiorske and some certain activity of the Russians in the vicinity of Makeyevka. If you remember, yesterday we were talking that the Russians were pretty active during the previous 24 hours, 48 already hours, and the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed our information that the Russians dealt some damage to the Ukrainian positions in the area, but without any attempts or any operations on the ground. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Siversk. We have lots of updates, yet we still haven't received any geolocations confirming that the Russians managed to establish complete control over Bilogorovka. We have adjusted the map based just on the report of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, who told us yesterday that as a result of clashes, the village was captured by the Russians. Now today we got a similar report, but about Klishchiivka we will get there in a second. So for now we will keep the area as is until we get some more or less reliable confirmation of Russian control. control. So the Russians continue that main offensive. Furthermore, we got the video of how the Russians were hunting the Ukrainians in Siversk itself. Siversk lately have been bombed by the Russians, let's say, very fiercely. On this video, we can see the arrival of another Avdiivka 1500. If you remember, the Russians promised that by the beginning of Kharkiv operation, at least lots of military experts stated that by the beginning of a Kharkiv offensive, the Russians will start using FAB 3000. But yet, we still haven't received even a single video confirming this. So maybe the Russians are keeping this type of weapon for some super thing or something like this, or maybe the Russians still haven't managed to create technology allowing them to attack Ukrainian positions from a safe distance with the FAB 3000. Anyway, when talking about Avdiivka 1500, currently this is the most fierce and the most massive weapon the Russians are using against the Ukrainian fortifications. Now let's move to Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Klishchiivka directions. As you may know, as you heard, as you read probably from the Ministry of Defense report, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over Klishchiivka. Furthermore, the Russians stated that they control over the hill 215.7, and the Russians established complete control over the hill 233, probably 0.7 as well. So the hills, which confirms that either the Klishchiivka in the lowlands and Klishchiivka on the western side, the tree and the forest located on the hill to the west, also are under complete Russian control. Significant victory. Basically, the Russians managed to, let's say, reduce till zero the Ukrainian progress during the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive. We see significant number of Russian drones flying above Klishchiivka with old Soviet victory flag. So the Russians are trying to troll Ukrainians as well. And we have a lot of Russian flags and many other things. So the village is under complete Russian control. The question is, I have, why the Ukrainians decided to fall back. What is the reason why the Ukrainians decided to run away? Because if believe Zelensky, the situation in Chasiv Yar is more or less stable. The Russians can't break through the Ukrainian defense belt. The Russians suffering significant losses and many other propaganda, let's say, posts from the president of Ukraine. So what is the reason why the Ukrainians decided to abandon their positions? Because they did have possibilities to fight for the hill for a very long time. At least 1-2 weeks they can win, but something happened. And right before I start making the video, we got a very interesting report from one of pro-Russian mappers, Divan Gishtab. They stated, probably they got some information from different sources, they stated that the units of the 98th Airborne Division crossed Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal, entrenched themselves on its western bank, and began assault operations towards Novy microdistrict. So, if we summarize everything that we just heard from the post, the Russians managed to break through this area to answer Chasiv Yar, basically from the west, from the south, and now this is a complete disaster. Yet we haven't received any geolocations confirming this or any other source confirm this, but we need more time, we need more, let's say, mappers to confirm this. But if it's true, if this information is correct, then that means that the Russians, without finishing the battle for eastern Chasiv Yar, managed to cross the river and started offensive operations towards the micro district by the name of Novy. So this is the black by the name of Novy. This is lowland, low-rise building area, which is not very big problem for the Russians to storm. And probably this is the reason, this piece of news, that the Russians broke through the Ukrainian defense belt, forced the Ukrainian commanders on the direction to make a very difficult decision, to abandon their positions on this side of a canal and to send as many as possible forces, as many as they can send from Klishchiivka, from Avdiivka in direction of Chasiv Yar, with the purpose to hold the front lines and not to allow the entire area to collapse. Because currently, exactly from this moment, from the 22nd of May of 2024, we can say that the situation for Chasiv Yar become critical. This is this crossing of canal has the same almost value as the Russians, let's say, made pipeline operation of Avdiivka. If you remember, when the entire south collapsed like automatically, this is the same operation as the Russians managed to move to the south from the Terikon and enter the northern, basically Avdiivka, and cut it into pieces. So this is significant victory. The Ukrainians most likely will not count their losses, will not count anything. They will counterattack the Russians with everything they have, and probably the next 3 days are going to be very bloody and very heavy for the Russians. But if the Russians are able to repel every single upcoming Ukrainian attack, then we can start counting days, not about the eastern Chasiv Yar, but about entire Chasiv Yar itself. The Russians continue improving their positions in the eastern part. I'll remind you that most of the Ukrainian forces in this area are encircled. They can't evacuate because canal is in the complete Russian control. The Russians continue improving, getting additional gains on the ground. The Russians published the first video. By the way, if just to point your attention that during the previous days we got the videos of battle for Chasiv Yar, but most of them were published by the Ukrainian sources. And today, for the first time since the beginning of the battle for the eastern Chasiv Yar, the Russian sources published the video of how they saw how they see this attack on this stronghold. The Russians captured most of the buildings in the eastern part and continued developing offensive further to the west. So the situation, to summarize everything, is critical for the Ukrainians, and I'm not sure how they're going to get from this situation out. So the Ukrainians abandoned Klishchiivka, and we understand probably why they did this. Now let's move to Avdiivka area. We have lots of updates from the territory. The Russians continue bombing and attacking Alexandropol. Another batch of FAB arrived in the area, and I'll remind you that if we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of months, we do this all regularly. The number of strikes on this territory is significant, and it's not just obviously attempts to destroy the Ukrainian positions. Probably this is a preparation before further offensive to the north, because currently we see that the situation develops very in Russian favor on the northern flank of let's say Toretsk, New York agglomeration. Now the Russians need to speed up and to improve their positions from the south. Now let's move to Cherezno. We have very interesting updates from Novoalexandrovka. Today the Ukrainians and the Russians published the video of how the first Russian squads entered the village, which confirms the Russian presence and the Russian control. Currently we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to improve their positions and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, or that attack was repelled by the Ukrainians and the Russians were forced to fall back. Anyway, we see geolocation and we will adjust the map, because most likely the Russians captured the first streets and the first buildings. We're just waiting for some time. We need this piece of news to live its own life, and maybe soon we're going to receive some updates from the Ukrainian sources. Now let's move to artillery pocket. The Ukrainians suffered also a lot of problems in this area. The Ukrainians stuck between the rivers, between water reservoirs on the line Sokol, Voshod, Evgeniev. Then to the south in direction of Velika Novoselovka, most of the bridges were destroyed during the previous phases of the offensive operation. The Ukrainians, after probably 2 weeks or 3 weeks of complete absence of any activity from this side, decided to start repairing or restoring the bridge or restoring the roads that Ukrainian armored vehicles can use to probably withdraw their positions, because I remember that this area probably is the area of responsibility mainly of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, who has a lot of, let's say, Western weapons like Bradleys, Abrams, let's say, in their group. So that's why it's the vital question for them to have possibilities to run away, to escape from the territory without losses. But the bridges are destroyed, and this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians. They don't know for sure how to do this, because if they will try, they can leave this area with infantry, but most likely then they will be forced to keep and leave their artillery systems, their, let's say, Western weapon between the fields, and they obviously will be captured by the Russians. Now we're moving to Nitailova. The Russians managed to improve their positions to the south, and most likely tomorrow the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation will report us that Nitailova is under complete Russian control. We have some mappers without geolocations for now, but most likely this is exactly what is going to happen. We got the first video of more or less, let's say, edge position of armored forces to the Ukrainian side of Krasnohorivka. The Russians, after a very short operational pause, started bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in the central part, and as I understand, based on this video, the edge Ukrainian positions are located in this school or hospital, and this is the edge Ukrainian position. So most likely the trenches by the Russians were captured during the previous phases. When we're talking about Novomikhailovka, we got more and more updates confirming the Russian progress. The Russians are pushing in direction of Paraskoivka. The Ukrainians trying to counterattack. They are taking everything they have, but it's obviously we see that this is not enough. The Russians smell the window of opportunity. They understand that if not now, then never, because most of the forces of the responsible forces for this direction were redeployed to Kharkiv direction. This is the first time, the best timings for the Russians to break through defense and capture Konstantinovka, and the fall of Konstantinovka will lead to collapse of entire front line, including Ugledar, Vadiana, many thousand settlements. So we see that Zelensky understands that Kharkiv for him is much more important than any other settlement all over the entire Ukraine. Kharkiv is the vital question for him, because if Kharkiv falls, then most likely Zelensky regime will fall as well, probably even 1 minute before the fall of Kharkiv, something like this. Now we're moving to South Donetsk direction. We have additional updates, additional progress of the Russian armed forces. We have the first geolocations confirming that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in the southern part of Staromaiorske and to capture the first streets and the first buildings in the area. So the Russians are advancing, the Ukrainians are forced to fall back, so there were very heavy clashes, there is the mining process, so everything, let's say, as usual. Very heavy assaults with significant number of tanks, armored vehicles, turtle tanks, significant number of infantry. The Ukrainians are falling back without any possibilities to show any resistance, because the main support currently is going to one direction, to Kharkiv. Of course, when talking about this direction, the Ukrainians try to counterattack. For these purposes, they even try to send some reinforcements from Velika Novasilovka, but the reinforcement was discovered by the Russians, and as a result of artillery strike and FAB strikes, the Russians managed to get the timings, let's say everything in time. There was a very heavy explosions, and the Ukrainian reinforcements was destroyed, and those two managed to survive were forced to fall back to the north in direction of Velika Novasilovka. But when talking about Velika Novasilovka, the situation is very critical, because today the Ukrainian sources published the final confirmation that the bridge was destroyed completely. Now the Ukrainians lost their possibility to use this supply road for communication, and which also will ease the further Russian progress to the north. So the situation on this direction is also very critical. We see that Ukrainians are falling back, and the main reason of that is complete absence of supply and support. Other sources are saying that the main problem of Ukrainians is mobilization, because the first talks, the first conversation about possible total mobilization in Ukraine started somewhere in December and January of 2024, and by the beginning of May, if the Ukrainians started total mobilization in the beginning of year, they would already have let's say probably maybe up to 100,000 soldiers of completely trained soldiers by either Ukrainian veterans or Western NATO officers. But now they're mobilizing forces, and after 3-4 days of short program of short exercises, these guys are being sent to the line of combat contact, where we understand that the average life cycle is less than a few hours, because it's impossible to survive under such a heavy Russian fire. I can't imagine myself in the epicenter of Avdiivka 1500. If I see this explosion not even just from within a few kilometers in front of my face, probably I would try to find a solution how to surrender as fast as possible. So this situation is so difficult. And on this video, Robotyne area, when talking about Robotyne area, we start receiving a lot of updates of how the Russians were bombing Malotokmachka, Novopokrovka. So this is very important, very interesting, because for the first time since the creation of this, let's say, direction, the Russians are bombing this territory so heavy. We can't tell for sure what exactly the Russians are planning to do. Maybe they have some certain plans, or maybe not, but this activity probably tell us that maybe the Russians also have some plans on this direction. They had these plans before, but the concentration of Ukrainian forces on the direction didn't allow the Russians, let's say in 2023, in the beginning of 2024, to, let's say, finish the plans. But now, as I understand, the Russians have everything necessary to complete this battle. So as you can see, the situation is very critical. This is very critical, and the worst thing ever is that the towns in Ukraine are empty. Men are afraid of going on the streets, because they understand that they would be captured immediately. The Ukrainians are in the, let's say, course of a total mobilization. If you are on the street and if you look like a man who can serve in the army, you would be captured immediately. No doubts, you wouldn't be able to capture. And the Ukrainians decided to do one thing. Basically, they decided to hide in their own apartments, but they forgot one important thing. Apartments in Ukraine is not like a property like apartments in Germany, in the United States of America. You can't let's say meet let's say recruiters in your apartments with the gun and to force them to fall back. Of course you're not. So basically the Ukrainians made the situation that forced the man all over the Ukraine to sit in their own homes, and if Ukrainian authorities know for sure that you are in the country, of course they will come to your home. And this is from one side the Ukrainians are trying to hide, but from the other side they got themselves into an ambush, because they are forced to stay at home and to wait when another recruiter will come for you, and you will not be able to run away or to escape, for example, from the 12th floor of a high-rise building or something like this. And furthermore, this situation is more good for the Ukrainians, because if they will start going by apartments and homes, then there will be less video records than we can see right now on the streets when the Ukrainian recruiters are capturing the Ukrainians over the entire Ukraine. Now you're just at home, and the only thing they need to do is break the door and to get you to the line of combat contact. That's it. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.